Hey people, it's ScionVyse, and in my last video I finished talking about all of the modern Prince of Persia games, so for this one I figured it'd be nice to tie this project up into a nice bow, at least until the Sands of Time remake comes out. So what better way to do that than with a nice list? Everybody likes lists. I covered 10 games in detail over the past year, so it makes sense to do a top 10 list from worst to best. If you've seen the review videos, you can probably take a guess as to what my order will be here, but it may not be that simple. Just before we start, a few rules and conditions first. I'm only talking about modern series games here, so no original or Shadow in the Flame here. I'm not including the mobile games either because they're terrible. Second, I'm ranking each of the Forgotten Sands games separately because they are different games. Third, I'm not ranking the ports differently, so Warrior Within on PSP and Rival Swords won't be here. With that out of the way, let's get right into it with my top 10 favorite Prince of Persia games. Yeah, so this was obviously going to be at the bottom of the list. Just the controls would send it down here, being some of the worst controls I've ever had to deal with in a platformer. But even ignoring the controls, the boring combat along with the repetitive and tedious level design would really cement it at the bottom. The only real praise I can give it is that the bosses are well designed and interesting, and some of Zhao's powers can be fun when they work. This is by far the worst Prince of Persia game I've played, and I recommend staying far away from it as much as possible. I don't even want to talk about it anymore, so let's just move on. Following up the bottom spot is the first of the Forgotten Sands games, the PSP version. This is a game that, in concept, I love. It feels like Prince of Persia, it has a lot of replayability, and conceptually it's really interesting, with the player being in complete control of the game's obstacles individually instead of all at once. But no matter how good a set of ideas it has, what really matters is the execution, and this is where Forgotten Sands on PSP falters. The aforementioned obstacles are really ham-fistedly designed to work with the game's main gimmick, and even getting those gimmicks to work is frustrating due to how the game is forced to control. On top of that, add in less than stellar combat, really bad chase sequences, and an absolutely horrible final boss, and you end up with a game that is less than the sum of its parts. That's a shame too, because the individual parts here are really great. Honestly, this game isn't even that bad. It does what it sets out to do decently, and while the actual core game design isn't really impressive at all, it's not the worst strategy game I've played. Everything is executed fine, and it has a lot of really nice ideas. The victory point system is a really nice twist on traditional strategy win conditions, and the entire deck building part of the game is another plus that makes it stand out from many of its contemporaries. The reason it's this low on the list isn't because it's a poorly made game, although the map design is pretty poor and the number of units makes chapters drag on way more than is necessary. The reason it's so far down on the list is because it's simply not Prince of Persia. You can call that unfair if you want, but I know what I like out of this franchise, and Battles doesn't give me any of it. It was an interesting experiment, and I do give it a lot of credit for that, but I come to this series for adventuring and platforming, and obviously that doesn't happen. On top of that, this game has the burden of trying to tie in the most likable version of the prince with the least likable version, and I don't know, something about that just rubs me the wrong way. If you've watched my video on this game, you'll know that I have some, let's say, strong opinions about it. And because of that, you may have expected this to be far lower on this list than where it is. While yes, I do have many issues with the game. A lot of the platforming is very automatic and it basically plays itself. The light seeds are a terrible design decision that actively makes the game worse, and the combat is at best style over substance. It's tedious, boring, and broken most of the time, but the game does have a lot of things going for it. Obviously, it still looks incredible even 13 years later. The cel-shaded art style, vibrant colors, cartoony effects, and really cool character designs make this a sight to behold, even compared to many newer games. Speaking of the characters, the Prince and Elika are both great, their banter and growth throughout the game is easily the best thing about it, and I'd argue these two make the best duo in the series. And while a lot of the details fall short in my opinion, I do respect the game's ambition. The fully open world that you can complete in basically any way you want is really cool, and I do like the idea, I just don't think it works in Prince of Persia at all. I've said this before and I'll say it again, if you love this game, I'm happy for you. I don't get it, but I am happy for you, and even despite all my misgivings, I'm still confident in putting it here at number 7. Well, wasn't this a pleasant surprise? When I started playing this game after completing Fallen King, I was dreading every second of it. But just like most of the other Forgotten Sands games, it blew my expectations out of the water. Almost every aspect of Fallen King is vastly improved here. Not just improved, but actually fun. The level design is much better and far more interesting, the combat was redesigned and is a blast, the Prince's powers are fewer but used far better, and most importantly, the controls actually work. The ability to just drag the stylus around rather than needing to perform another press every time you want to do anything makes the entire experience way smoother and much more fun. It's not all good though, the bosses are a clear step down from Fallen King, the writing is pretty awful, Razia's personality in particular was pretty grating, and the game is incredibly buggy. But even then, I really had a great time playing through it, and I think it holds the title for best purely handheld Prince of Persia game. So this is a weird one, and I think putting it straight in the middle is just right. Warrior Within had some really big shoes to fill, releasing just a year after Sands of Time. It somehow managed to not only fill those shoes pretty well, refining and expanding on what Sands of Time did, but simultaneously went up to Sands of Time, screamed "You're not my real dad," and went into its room to listen to Godsmack's I Stand Alone on repeat for 3 hours straight. So yeah, on one hand, the platforming mechanics are purely a step up from Sands of Time, taking everything that worked, refining or changing what didn't, while experimenting with the level design in a way that was a bit more open, but still had a lot of the same core philosophy that worked in Sands of Time. It didn't completely work, and Sands of Time's level design is still better, but it's far from the worst set of levels in the series. But on the other hand, the combat lost all sense of rhythm and devolved into a hack and slash that you were often better off skipping if possible. On top of that, the game's tone is the edgiest, most unpleasant the series has ever gotten, and the Prince has never been more unlikable. I'm definitely happy the team steered away from this direction for Two Thrones. This was a huge surprise. I mean, the entirety of Forgotten Sands was a huge surprise, being 4 unique games released for 4 different systems all at the same time. Seriously, when I was planning out this project, I thought it was just gonna be one game that I'd simply play on PC and be done with. But the fact that the Wii version is so good really threw me for a loop, because you don't expect it. It was a Wii version to a movie tie-in in 2010. Traditional knowledge would assume that this would be completely horrible, but it really wasn't. Sure, the combat wasn't great, because waggle controls for combat is never great, but that's really my biggest gripe. The Wii Remote really isn't a fantastic controller, and in hectic sections it was pretty likely to drop inputs. However, the new powers using the Wii Remote's pointer are fun and decently designed. I really love how much freedom the game gives you in the latter half. The puzzles here too are also not only fun, but plentiful, easily some of the best the series has been able to create, and adding to all of that, the level design is easily the best in the series. So on top of being really well designed, it's filled to the brim with content, has by far the biggest selection of extras in the series, and while the story wasn't particularly deep and left quite a few plot threads hanging, I really liked the Prince and his companion Zara throughout the entire adventure. It's really an underrated gem, and while it is by far the most different and unique platformer in the series, it captures that Prince of Persia feel better than most of them. Warrior Within was a really divisive game. A lot of people really liked it, and a lot hated it. I'm obviously in the middle, but there were a lot of things that I would have changed if I had the choice. Thankfully, Ubisoft heard the criticisms of it when making the next game, and they took what I'd argue is the best possible route. They didn't completely wipe Warrior Within from the record books, and Two Thrones starts exactly where it ended, but the over-the-top, dark and edgy tone is completely gone, replaced with a feel much more in line with what we knew from Sands of Time. A specter of that era did remain in the form of the Dark Prince, who I actually did really like. He was a good foil for the prince and did a good job of acting like a little devil on the prince's shoulder throughout the adventure. On the gameplay side of things, Two Thrones is yet another iterative jump over what came before. The core gameplay, both in platforming and in combat, is very similar to Warrior Within, just noticeably improved. The prince's moveset during platforming is barely changed, but shines much better thanks to the more linear level design, and the Dark Prince gets his own set of abilities which really helps vary up the experience. The combat is the same story, with the prince being nearly identical to Warrior Within, but with the Dark Prince added to give a different feel to the combat. This title also introduced stealth mechanics which were pretty great. They never returned in Prince of Persia, unfortunately, but made up a huge part of its spiritual successor, Assassin's Creed. In a lot of ways, Two Thrones is the best game in the original trilogy, but is just missing that special something which keeps it only as high as number 3 for me. This is why you don't listen to Metacritic, kids. I guess technically the PC version that I played scored a bit higher than the Wii version, but on average, this version of Forgotten Sands is the lowest scoring of all the home console Prince of Persia games, and I have no idea why. After years and years of games moving further and further away from the magic that Sands of Time created, Forgotten Sands genuinely feels like the direct follow-up that Sands of Time deserved. The platforming feels incredible, easily the best this series has ever felt, and while its core is directly based off of Sands of Time, it includes ideas from later games and it introduces its own too. The new Jin powers are really simple but are used incredibly well. The level design and platforming challenges created by the Power of Flow and Power of Memory in particular are really great. The combat is also some of the most fun I've had with combat in the series. Yes, it's very simple, and compared directly to other similar hack-and-slash games, it's rudimentary at best, but there is enough here to keep me interested for whenever it pops up, and it's not the primary focus, so it never really outstays its welcome. Yeah, I really don't know why this game wasn't given the attention and recognition that it deserved. Really, the only thing I can think of is the confusion created by releasing 4 games with the same name at the same time, kinda making each individual game blend together and fall through the cracks a bit. Like, if someone didn't like the PSP version and talked bad about it, it may discourage others from trying the other versions, thinking they're just as bad. The main version of Forgotten Sands is an absolute blast though, and in my opinion, a must-play for fans of the series. Listen, from the first second of this video, everybody knew this was coming, and to be honest, I was trying to find a way to justify putting Forgotten Sands or Two Thrones above it, because both of those games have more varied mechanics, play much smoother, and look a lot better. So yeah, if you want, you can say this placement is entirely nostalgia and knock it down to 2 or 3, and I really couldn't argue with you. But there's just something about this game, and earnestness in its design, writing, and presentation that even with the slightly antiquated game design, still makes it a super charming experience to go through even 18 years later. I know that's a cop-out, but there are real reasons why it's great too. Despite later installments adding new mechanics, pretty much none of them managed to have better, more interesting level design. Ubisoft really got the most out of these mechanics and basically perfected the structure right out of the gate. The combat is, again, really great, and it's a shame that none of the other games even tried to build on what this game had. Using the time powers to defeat enemies was fun, and the system had a rhythm to it that made each encounter as much a dance as it was a battle. The only issue I have with the game is that most of the combat sections go on a bit too long, and while the combat is fun and challenging, the length of these sections can be grueling later on. But yeah, I love this game, and even after going through everything that came after it, I still think it's my favorite entry. Many have come close, and if I were putting these games into tiers, the top 3 would be side by side at the top. But ultimately, Sands of Time has the edge for me, and in my opinion, is the best Prince of Persia game. And that is my list of the top 10 best modern Prince of Persia games, in my very biased opinion, of course. What do you think? Do you agree? Disagree? Would you swap anything around? Flip that upside down? I certainly hope not. But with this done, I'm officially done with everything Prince of Persia for now. I think I've covered basically everything I want to for the time being, unless something else pops up into my head. I'll definitely be talking about the Sands of Time remake whenever that comes out, for better or worse. Anyways, thank you so much for watching if you made it all the way to the end, and I will see you all later.